So today we are discussing AI and art conservation, especially paintings conservation, paintings on canvas, thanks to Alex, who works at the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is a really, really huge research institution in the US. And so that's how you came about from a background of engineer. You met art in the middle and mixed it with AI, and I just can't wait to hear what you have to say to us. Maybe you can continue a bit with your presentation of yourself first, and maybe after introduce us to all this wonderful research.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you all for joining here. As Sarah said, I'm an engineer at MIT, and most of the work that I do here is tied with semiconductor fabrication and other very small scale precise technologies. And as an engineer and as someone who has been into art, I thought it would be interesting a few years ago to try and see what the interplay of technology and art could be in a way that I could contribute to. And I think many of y'all have probably heard of the work that I published somewhat recently. It's been a couple months, but basically on the masking of losses on an artwork and really translating a lot of the computational tools that exist out there for image painting into actual restorations made plausible with some fabrication techniques that emerge from nanofabrication and other types of engineering. So there's a lot of really fun technical conversations to be had in the way that these materials work and in the way that these tools are applied and what roles they have and can play in the conservation process. I think a lot of journalists who have covered my work have covered it really improperly, and there are a lot of misleading headlines out there. Some of my favorites are that, journalists, some have said that I'm trying to replace conservators. I have no idea where they get that from. Every time I've talked with them, I've told them absolutely not. I've made a tool that can help conservators in the conservation process. It's by no way a replacement of the enormous amount of labor and talent that goes into restorations. So I'm happy to delve into some of the more technical sides and to talk about some of the ethical concerns that are present in the application of a technique like the one I made. And just happy to talk with y'all about any questions or concerns y'all might have.
I just interrupt you really shortly because I didn't say it before, but anyone who has questions, you can just put them in the chat, and you can do it either in French if it's easier for you, or in English. I'll just translate them and read them myself, so it's easier if not everyone opens their mics and after it's chaos. So feel free to really write in the chat. There is absolutely no problem. I will read every message that I see, so you have all the feedback and all the questions. Also, I really agree that journalists don't do honor to the work you did. They really misshape what you have researched, and reading your article in open access and seeing your video on YouTube, I was really in awe of what technology could do, and also how journalists can misshape information. So just as a disclaimer, we are not here to replace our conservator. We are just here to discuss what is the future of conservation, and I'm really glad that you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's in the technology world, I think there's really this idea that the developments in technology that we make can be cross-applied. There's a very multidisciplinary aspect to conservation. I think many of you obviously know that, we have chemists who play a role in things, as well as materials scientists, art historians, mechanical engineers, people who are on the software side of things, the developers of all the fun equipment and imaging apparatuses that play a role in the analysis of artworks. So art has always involved a lot of different types of technology playing into it. And in this case, I think, you know, I made the step forward of saying, what about some of the image inpainting tools? And I think there was a fair amount of controversy generated from doing so. And I think for y'all, what's probably most meaningful to recognize is that all of these tools are very adaptable, and the way that they're applied can be very much fine-tuned. So a few days ago, the New York Times published a piece about my work and the role it could play in some particular cultural heritage projects. And the one that they highlight is there's a group in Italy that's working on the restoration of chapel frescoes. You know, in 2016, they had major earthquakes across Italy, and that led to vast amounts of damage to a lot of the churches in the country. And they reached out to me asking if it was possible to apply masking techniques to the damaged frescoes that they have, but do so in a way that uses trateggio, so vertical in-painting line styles, in order to actually in-paint the losses. And that's very easy to do. I've written up code for them to be able to generate those masks with trateggio style in-painting, so not even trying to do full aesthetic reconstruction. And that's really plausible to do because masks are generated computationally. So there's these different types of applications, and there's a lot of ways to adapt these tools. And you all, as conservators, will understand how important it is to have that kind of flexibility. And it is a little unfortunate that journalists across the world, they're not familiar with this, so they're not interested in writing about it in their pieces as much.
Good. Could you describe, I don't know if you had a presentation prepared, or if you could just describe what was really the grounding of your research, and maybe explain a little bit how, well, you explained how you came to that kind of research, but also the more technical details, for instance, the substrates that you use, how the films are made, but also how they are applied, because there is, you need a conservator at that point. Yes. So that's really interesting. If you could just...
I might be able to actually share some visuals as well. Cool. I see the question in the chat, what substrate is used for the masking technique? And my substrate, I presume you mean the actual film that the mask is made out of. I assume so. And that film is made out of this proprietary blend of short chain hydrocarbons, and they're bound together very loosely, and they also include some UV absorbers in there. And it's a 10 micron thick film on which can carry printed pigments on it and be interfaced with a layer of conservation grade varnish to form an optically transparent bond. And I know that that's a lot of words, so I think I might be able to actually bring up something that more closely shows what I'm on about with the actual layering that's present. So let me actually bring this up here. I have some visuals that I think y'all would actually appreciate. Let's see. Would y'all be able to see this slide here?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so this shows the cross-sectional schematic of the way that this membrane is made. So in order to get full color reproduction abilities in a mask, there needs to be a backing layer of opaque white ink in order to abide by a subtractive color model. And in this case, the white ink is transferred onto this membrane, and the membrane is very thin. So when it's delaminated from its carrier substrate, it's only around 10 microns thick. And that membrane is then combined with the actual subtractive color ink layer in order to achieve proper color reproduction. So those two membranes are layered on top of one another and loosely aligned before achieving full alignment of the two different types of colors. So what that leads to, on the right here, you can see the complexity of this microstructure there. So the white ink regions overlay the color ink regions in this case, and this mask is flipped onto an artwork to actually in-paint losses. But this mask as a whole consists of multiple layers of carrier polymers, those short chain hydrocarbons that I mentioned, the interfacing varnishes, and then water-soluble adhesives that enable the delamination of the mask. So the mask as a whole, it's really, it is genuinely hair thin. So once it's fabricated, the mask actually ends up being only around 30 microns thick and transparent regions of the mask. So that's around a third the diameter of a human hair. So this mask, once it's made, is thinner than most kinds of resin varnishes that are applied to paintings conventionally. So once this mask is made and applied to an artwork, the exposed chains of the varnish polymers on it bind to the varnish on an artwork to create this optically transparent bond. So you'll see here a damaged area of an artwork, the mask during the process of being applied, and then once the transparent bond is formed. So it proceeds sector by sector, and then once it's actually applied over the entire painting, you end up with the visual restoration effect that's apparent in proper lighting and a proper viewing distance. And we can talk more about some of the technical sides of things. I think it's meaningful to see the practical significance of a technique like this in terms of what it can provide during the conservation process. I think the main one is that you can accurately simulate what the restoration outcome will be. And on the left is a simulation. So the way that this simulation worked was I took a digitally made mask and overlaid it over the original artwork. And I can show you here the way that that process works. It's pretty simple. You just take the digitally made mask and overlay it over an artwork. And that simulation matches up reasonably closely with the way that the physical result actually looks like. And there are a few differences. We can talk about those a bit. But overall, this provides a way of predicting how a restoration outcome will look like given some kind of paradigm for in-painting. So there's, let me, how do I do, there we go. Just to talk face to face then. There's a huge benefit in being able to estimate the time that in-painting will take and be able to see, you know, is the way that you're choosing to in-paint certain types of losses actually consistent with the overall goal of a restoration? So this mask is generated, and what that means is that different parameters in that process can be adjusted. So one of the major parameters that I built into the code for this was saying basically how intense or aggressive does the mask need to be? So in the conservation world, we're very familiar with certain types of losses being not too significant. You know, if there's a light scratch on a painting or some pigment fading that doesn't actually affect the look of it, that doesn't generally need to be overpainted. So putting that into code means that you can test out different types of masks, masks that address more damages or masks that address fewer damages. And that can give you a sense of how a restoration will turn out and whether or not it's going to meet the goals of whatever restoration you're undertaking. And I've seen a number of different conservators reach out to me who have had very different objectives with this process. One of my favorites was I had a conservator of Buddhist heritage art, so Buddhist Tankas works on textile, reach out, and she was interested in being able to apply these techniques for purely digital restoration with the express condition that they never actually restore their tankas. These fabric works of art, the damage is part of their history, and so it's very enough to do anything to attempt to restore them. But in the digital world, it provides them with a new way of interpreting the art and seeing it as it might have originally been. So there's these different applications. It's very flexible, and I think that's probably the most important part about it, is you can adapt it to different challenges based on what you need and how that process goes. So let me see here. There's Sarah, can you distill some of these questions?
Yeah,
I
sure.
don't want to spend the time.
No, I will. I was looking for an opening to ask you. So William asks to resolve small colored losses of color. It may be fairly simple, but when there are large lacunas, and I really agree with this question, how do you reconstruct it?
Yeah.
Maybe what is the process? How do you decide how it's done? It's basically a decision that we have to make as art conservators. How far do we go in the interpretation of the artwork? How do you code this? And what is...
Yeah, I'll show you. This is one area that journalists did not care about, really, and I think you will appreciate it. You see the slide, right? Yes, or?
Yes, we do. Sorry.
Okay. So this is showing in the painting in the study. This was the old restoration of the infant here, and once I'd removed the overpainting, there's really not much of the face left here. There's a few rays here, and you can see that the amount of overpainting was really aggressive. It was a very crudely done old restoration. But this infant was painted in a number of other works by the attributed artist, the master of the proto-adoration. And in fact, these infants are so close in scale that I suspect they were painted from a template, to the point where the structural features of the face of the infant painted on different artworks by the same artist, they actually align to within 10 micrometers of the scale of some of the features on the infant in the painting in the study. So what that meant I could do was take the infant that had the best matched geometry of the eyes and ear, really getting the right posture, and overlay it in a way that masked basically the surviving areas and integrated them in a way that the original artist presumably intended. If this was a templated feature, and it's very likely it was, given the structural and the precision of the match, then this is perhaps the best way to recreate what that original complex aesthetic feature looked like. So for larger areas, I think you'll see here, this is an animation that shows the result, and it's a very slow animation, so you might have to pay attention repeatedly to see how different areas are visually reconstructed. But a lot of the very large losses here are actually aesthetically somewhat simple. And perhaps the most complex ones are tied with either human facial features or with some nuanced details such as trees and leaves. And in those particular circumstances, so for instance, in this case, this is an extremely complicated loss over here. And in the past, the way this was usually dealt with is just pretty much crude overpainting over all of these individual paint fragments. This is very difficult to structurally reintegrate. But with pattern transfer and the use of partial convolution tools for image inpainting, we can actually cross-apply some of the leaf features that are present and be able to inpaint this in a very clear, precise way where all of the surviving paint fragments are visible on the right, but they are masked together with a computationally infilled pattern representative of what the leaves surrounding the space look like. So what I think this lets us do is take patterns that are present in an artwork kind of inherently and extend them over some of the larger areas of loss that might incorporate those patterns. And in such a way, the way that these tools work is they incorporate the context of an entire image and map a pattern within the image. So you're not even using different artworks to inpaint those kinds of losses. It's all based on the image that you are working with. What that means is that you're not incorporating a different artist's aesthetics into inpainting. you're only using what's present on an artwork and extending a pattern. And I think there's other tools of doing this. You can also, obviously do a much more simple approach of just using a monotone coloration without extending any pattern. I think in this case, given that this is a Flemish Renaissance work, some of the detailing was really important to the artist and the presentation of the artwork. So for features like the face of the infant, taking that templated feature from other works by the artist and incorporating it, I think that's an ethical way of approaching the restoration. People can disagree with me, and it's a dialogue to see what's appropriate and what's not. But I hope you see the various ways that there are to repair both small and larger losses.
Yeah, what I understand is that you make the decision based on the same patterns as we do as art conservators.
Absolutely.
Meaning that
and I think if you listen to the journalists, a lot of journalists have said that, oh, I've made an AI that repairs paintings, and that's not true. I've applied a variety of techniques, but it is still a very supervised process. Each type of loss is addressed in a supervised way, and I see basically what aesthetic changes are introduced and apply them in places that I think are relevant, and don't apply them in places that I think are inconsistent with the restoration. So it's still a process that involves a lot of supervision by a conservator, but in this case, you don't have to do color matching, you don't have to do pattern replication, and I think the most important part is you don't have to do extremely fine in-painting within jagged contours, and especially of gradients where it's otherwise not really possible to achieve them.
Yeah. So this is mainly that the decision making is still human, and there is still a lot of monitoring, but the handwork, I would say, is much more precise because it's machine made, and this allows to have colors that match even better than what our eyes could do, from what I understand.
Absolutely.
So maybe next question, or if
someone asking about removing the mask. Is that the next? Yeah. So absolutely. I think this is the one that conservators have cared about the most, and the good news is you can directly remove it, either through peeling or through dissolving it with basically any conventional solvent except for water. So this mask is extremely fragile. And the reason I made it that way was to ensure that it was easy to remove from an artwork. And you'll see here, this is just demonstrating applying and removing it off of just a transparent mask on the artwork. So the actual membrane materials, as I mentioned before, they're short chain hydrocarbons, and they can be dissolved in most conservation grade solvents. And even more importantly, the bond between this membrane and the artwork is a partially oxidized interface between varnishes. So that bond is extremely weak, which means that taking off the mask, it applies very little stress. It's basically the same amount of stress as you would expect with a static film that's attached to something. And this is accelerated too. I've also artificially aged the mask to understand whether or not the mask would age in an inappropriate way. And the good news is that the maximum fading that I was able to achieve with a simulated large amount of illumination was very limited. And in the absolute worst case, if this mask was left on an artwork for some reason that was exposed to huge intensity light for a century and without any UV absorbers, this is what the artwork would eventually look like. And this is bad. This is a degree of fading that's pretty unacceptable. But UV absorbers prevent this from being an issue. And obviously you shouldn't display artworks in lighting conditions that are basically direct sunlight. But to touch back just on the way that this mask works, it's very fragile. The bond between the mask and the painting it's effectively the strength of a film that's attached to something with static electricity. It's a very, very fragile application, which means that, you know, once you remove the mask, it's not really easy to put back on. But it does mean that there's very little chance in harming the artwork with removing the mask. So I hope that addresses some of the concerns here.
Yeah, I think you answered to the next two questions. So that's
already. Oh boy.
Oh yes, there is one question from Carla, and she asks, so the aging process you talked about, and is the mask likely to interact with the surface? To which I would add, does it have to be on a varnished surface, or if you have a painting without varnish, can you apply it without danger?
So I'll answer the second question there first. Okay. I don't think this should at all be applied to unvarnished paintings.
Okay.
And I've tried to be clear about this kind of everywhere, that this is a very restricted technique. Mm-hmm. It should not be used for many types of artwork. I developed this for panel paintings, which have very smooth surfaces and have oil paint layers that are pretty well bound to the substrate. And because the substrate isn't flexible, there's fewer microfractures that might otherwise result in potential interaction issues. Mm-hmm. So developing this for canvas will take considerably more time. Okay. But the interactions with the surface, that's where the varnish plays a major role. So having a layer of varnish on the artwork and a layer of varnish on the mask, and having that very weak bond between two dried varnishes be the structural support of this adhesion, that means that the bond is very weak. There's next to no migration of chemicals that I can imagine between the two. And there's no, you know, the extent of the interaction is basically what is the interaction between varnish and the surface of oil paint. So yes, varnish does, you know, topologically cover paint layers and can interact in ways that require solvents to be removed fully. But I think we have enough data to support that being a generally safe process for most oil paintings. So mm-hmm. the extent of that interaction is pretty well documented. I do think that there are concerns with the long-term chemical degradation of the mask. And that's, you know, especially with accelerated aging or exposure to ultraviolet light. And all I can say is I've evaluated that for heat resistance and for UV resistance, but it will take actual experiments to see how this mask evolves over time. And I'm running those currently, but those take years. So you'll have to, mm-hmm. you know, see how that data comes out, and we'll see what.
We'll invite you back in a few years then, just to make sure we have all the data.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you. So Carla also, I think she's.
I love these questions. Well, these are great questions.
Yeah, yeah, they are. They are. She was asking, in what extent is it sustainable in terms of dimensional change and color change? So the color change you showed us, but the dimensional change, I don't think there might be many, as you don't play it with water, right?
Yeah, no, so there's the dimensional change. So actually, there is a dimensional change. That is a pretty important one. Mm-hmm. And that dimensional change is not necessarily in the shrinkage or expansion, but in the surface tension of the mask. Mm-hmm. So what happens is, as the kind of free-floating polymers start to cross-link and bind together, the surface tension of the mask increases, and it ends up getting smoother and glossier as it dries. So that process, I say as it dries, really as it interacts with oxygen, because it dries within 3 minutes, but once it's applied within a couple of days of oxygen exposure, the surface tension causes all of the layers to compress basically internally into each other even further, and results in a very smooth application of the mask with an upper surface that's basically fully cohesive with the surface of the artwork. So in terms of the longer term effects and how it ages and whether it shrinks, there's no long-term shrinkage. So it basically, the way to think of this process is it's a very soft film, and then it crystallizes. So it turns fully solid and brittle. And that means that removing it's pretty easy. It falls apart in some places. So it's difficult to take it off an artwork in a full, beautiful sheet, as you might want it to be, because it is just that fragile. But as it evolves over time, it basically turns into a transparent layer over painting, much like a varnish, where you can't really, varnishes that, solidify, some of them retain some degree of softness, and that's certainly the case here. But there's no shrinkage or expansion that would otherwise be induced through just aging. And heat causes the mask to soften and melt at very low temperatures. So one of the ways to ensure its removal is to lightly heat the surface, and that makes it even more soft and easy to remove.
Okay. What would be the minimum temperature to heat it?
So the way in the published version, anything above 45 C, and it basically starts melting. So it's a very weak polymer. So, that's another reason not to display it with direct sunlight, because sunlight can definitely heat surfaces to that temperature, and that would just cause the mask to melt. But 45 C is high enough that in most cases, you're not going to encounter that temperature in the reasonable display of an artwork.
Yeah, well,
or at least
where you exhibit it, but yeah, surely. Good, thanks.
So I see Carla asked, can the texture of the mask be adapted to the texture of the pictorial layer? At this point, just glossy is kind of the extent to which I've tested it to work well. I think matte is possible, but the textures of artworks span much more than just the reflection of light off of them. There's canvas textures, there's the subsurface diffraction and reflection and absorbance that all plays a role in the way that light interacts with pigments. And in this case, I think that's one of the biggest drawbacks of masked restoration, is that the result is necessarily pretty glossy. And if an artwork is not intended to be viewed like that, or the paint layer is not meant to be portrayed like that, then a mask just shouldn't be used. So there's the majority of restorations that are done on paintings, I don't think they should use masks. This is a very, very bespoke technique that works well for paintings that have thousands upon thousands of losses and not enough resources to support a full manual conservation.
Good. Do you think you could apply a matte varnish on top of the film to make it matte? Or
yeah, you can do that, and I've tried doing that. The issue is just in the tests that I've done, the artworks were not intended to be viewed matte, so it just introduces a cloudiness that wasn't meant to be there in the first place.
All right.
So,
all right. But if the artwork were meant to be matte,
then I think that
be a
can
possibility. Okay, good to know. Check. And how long does it take to produce such a mask? Because from what I understood, it's a multi-layer mask. So you have to produce all these layers, and also it seems to be small squares or rectangles that you just put next to the other. So how long is it?
So for a small painting, so the painting in the study was 50 by 60 centimeters. I don't know if we're calling that small or large. With the artworks I tend to work with, that's a pretty large painting, but I know many of you probably work with artworks that are in the meter scale. So that's that might not be large. Yeah. For this mask, so the time it takes to the time it takes to produce one mask is dependent on how complex it is and how many actual lost regions are in it. So in this case, the way I like to think of it is there were 5,000 losses that were restored with this mask, and producing the mask took around 4 hours. And that's just the manual time of taking these different layers and aligning them to get full color reproduction. And long term, that's not going to be an issue. I think within 6 months, I'll be able to make masks within 5 minutes. And the reason for that is that the hardware used to make these masks tends not to be precise enough. And because I've been outsourcing basically production of the subcomponents of these masks, I haven't had access to the actual printing hardware to be able to calibrate it to be precise enough. So one of the major things that I've done is approached the tolerance of restoration. And actually, I'll show you all this because I think this is one of those areas that's pretty significant, but it's difficult to interpret without getting to see. Let me do this. So in order to get a mask to sit on a painting appropriately, the mask has to be very precisely aligned. So if it's slightly moved around or it's misplaced, it's no longer useful at all. And what you see in this case is what happens when the relative layers of the mask are shifted by a couple millimeters. So being able to achieve the precision of alignment there is of paramount significance. And there exist printers that will be able to do that directly, but at the moment it does take some manual tuning in order to get to that level of precision.
Okay. Good. So this is for how long it takes. And check. Oh, yes. Okay. Do you think it will be possible to make similar masks, obviously in parts following the form of object, for 3D, sorry, for 3D polychromed objects using photogrammetry model? This is a really precise question.
Yes, no, it is a great question. The answer is yes. You're not the first to ask it. A lot of people have reached out asking if they can use masks on more sculptural works. I think the answer is yes. I have not done it. I'm purely working with paintings, so, and I don't really have the bandwidth to demonstrate this on statues and 3D polychromed objects. My only worry with a lot of 3D applications is just the materials are different than an oil painting, and so I haven't demonstrated compatibility with the different types of surfaces that might be used in such works and their compatibility with a mask like this. But conceptually, there's no issue with it, or at least I don't see one. So,
yeah, okay. So it could be made in the future, just someone has to
do it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. So William asks, when removing the mask with the solvents, does it dissolve?
So eventually, yes. So, but the bond dissolves first. So if that makes sense, the bond is extremely fragile, and so is the mask. But basically, the solvent can be used to break the bond, and eventually, and by eventually I mean like within a minute or two, then the mask will start dissolving. Okay. So the way that in the worst case that I've simulated to basically show that the mask can be removed from any surface, assuming that it's, for some reason not peeling off, maybe it was applied incorrectly and the bond is just too strong. Applying a solvent to dissolve that bond, whatever solvent works for the varnish that was used, the mask can just be peeled off with that bond severed. And if need be, and I'm not in support of this, but the mask can be dissolved in place by placing basically a sponge with solvent over it and have the solvent slowly eat away at the mask and have it be absorbed into a sponge that's placed on top. But that process runs the risk of having the dissolved mask migrate into a paint layer or into cracks or crevices that are present. And I generally don't think that's necessarily a good thing to do. So the preference is always to peel off the mask from an artwork, which if it's applied correctly, it takes 30 seconds to do.
But if I don't know, I'm not a paintings conservator, so this is one idea that I have, but maybe it's stupid. But if your varnish doesn't dissolve in the same solvent that you use to dissolve the mask, maybe you can apply it with one of these, let's call it sponge materials that help make the mask more easier to peel off or even to dissolve.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
you could just let it dissolve completely and then kind of wipe it off the artwork.
Yeah, there's a chance that that's I when I was developing the technique, I thought there was this elegance to being able to just remove the mask without having to dissolve it.
A bit of mask for painting,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, but I agree. There's various ways of removing it, and if the varnish that is used is chemically distinct enough from the membrane composition, then yes, different solvents can be used to selectively dissolve one or the other, in order to remove it in cases where things have gone wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Next question is from Federico, and he says, "Hi, Alex. Thank you for sharing your work. Regarding artificial intelligence, can you give us some specific information from a technical standpoint about digitally reintegrating gaps?" Sorry, it's a way too long word for me. Do you use Python, or do you use Python libraries?
Yeah. So if you go to the Nature paper, there's a link to a CodeOcean repository that has the code for generating the masks in that publication. And that's all Python based. But that code is primarily meant for generating a mask after a virtually digitally inpainted image exists. So the way that the different types of models are applied, the method that I publish in the paper is one that I think it's not as automated, but it is most accessible to a global community. You can just go into the Adobe suite of software, and as you might not know this, but Adobe, the company, is at the leading forefront of in-painting research. So they fund a lot of groups. One of the major ones is at the University of Pennsylvania that work on creating in-painting models, and they package those models as add-ons within their suite of software. So a lot of it, the stuff I used for this publication is a year old, and so in the world of computer science, it's basically completely outdated. So, there's a lot of new models being built. You should obviously use the most state-of-the-art ones that exist. And right now, I know Adobe is the one that's at the leading forefront of packaging them in ways that people can use. So if you're not software, savvy, and you don't want to use the code, that's fine. And you can just use those more manual annotation tools that exist to make it possible to do without having to write any code. I think there are a lot of in-painting models that do exist in the diffusion space, and you can see there's a lot of models being made by both independent researchers and larger companies, and those can be applied in various ways. The patched partial convolution, there's a variety of Python libraries for doing that. And the only reason that I'm not publishing those for use in large images is because I think they perform worse than the models that Adobe has developed. So there's ways to do patched application of these models over very large images of artworks. And for some reason, or perhaps just because the amount of funding that individuals had in making those models, it's the larger corporate models are the ones that perform the best.
Sure. Good, thank you. Next question is from Venetia. And so she says, "Hello, Alex. Thank you for your time today. I'm currently writing a master dissertation on how AI can help paper conservation. Do you have any thoughts on this? Is it worth developing a code of using AI? As a lot of concerns ethically have conjured in my research, and such as authenticity and authorship." Thank you.
Yeah, so I was a few weeks ago at the San Francisco Museums of Art, talking with the conservators in the San Francisco area from the De Young and Legion museums, and their paper conservator kind of asked me a similar question of, is there a way to apply these tools to paper? And from the digital side, the answer I think is absolutely yes. So it is very possible to apply these tools to the digital restoration of paperworks as long as the image is of sufficient quality. And the main concern there, as with paintings, is are you introducing too much? Are you changing too much? Are you overpainting to an extent that's unethical? And that's why I put in so much work into understanding what is the scale at which restoration is plausible, what are the concerns with visualization. So if you go to, I'll give a brief rundown to show y'all how meaningful it can be to do all of these different things. So with tolerance in particular, we can model this misalignment by just parameterizing it and understanding what is the minimum feature scale that we can work with to do a reasonable restoration. And this comes from this idea that, you know, everything is imperfect. When you apply something like a mask to an artwork, you're not going to precisely position it. So knowing that, what is the minimum size that we can work with? And that's analyzed here to arrive at 500 microns roughly. And in terms of actually generating a mask, one of the major concerns from an ethical standpoint is, are you overpainting? So in this case, if you look at these two images, the damaged one on the left and the digitally restored one on the right, if you just take a map of all the pixels that are different, this is the result of a lot of the patched algorithms being applied to major damages. This is ridiculous. This is too many, like this is vast amounts of overpainting. So the way to constrain that is to pay attention to what the human eye sees. So some of the algorithms that I've written are based on what human vision perceives as the major differences between these two in terms of the color value and the color saturation. And thresholding these gives you much more constrained, much more precise masks that more closely understand what humans see, what are the major damages here. And in the end, the mask that's made is very fine-tuned to the damages that are present without resulting in too much overpainting. Mm-hmm. So that kind of approach, I think, helps address a lot of those ethical concerns of overpainting. I think in terms of authenticity and authorship, that's where either cross-applying styles that are present within an image already or cross-applying styles of the same artist are probably the most ethical uses of AI in this case. Mm-hmm. So I've had several artists reach out to me and tell me basically that they would they've read what people have said, the criticisms that have emerged, what journalists have written, and they just wanted to tell me that they really would like for their artworks to be conserved in the future by using their own aesthetics from other works that they've painted. So I'm of the understanding that artists behind these works would appreciate their own works being used to restore them visually. So I think, obviously this will depend on the kind of work that you're working with. And I'm not familiar too much with paper works to be able to speak authoritatively on that matter. But it is very possible to do the application of these tools in a way that's ethical and consistent with the artist's intention. So I say go for it, and I'm happy to support development on this front. A lot of people have reached out to collaborate with me, and I'm trying to do so, but the more people reach out, the less time I have for each one, so I might not be able to help too much.
Sure. One thing that I note as a paper conservator, maybe Venetia, you agree with me or maybe not, but paper is really much more thinner than paintings. So I can't really imagine using masks on.
Oh, I should clarify. I was talking about purely digital restorations. I don't think masks should be used for papers at all.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And because it's really, we use Japanese paper for backing any paper that lacks strength and rigidity, but this is completely different. It's not a mask that you apply on it. It's rather on the other side. So and it's a structural restoration, not in paintings. And I think it's a bit different. So I don't know, Vanessa, how you work with it, but I would be really interested in knowing a bit more.
I will comment on the paper side. I've had paper conservators from museums and private paper conservators suggest, and I think this is probably the only way to do so reasonably, basically to apply the mask in a pigment deposition process similar to the way that the original paper artwork was made. So one of the I had a paper conservator reach out to me who works on poster conservation, posters that are made with basically some form of printing process or offset block printing. And they were suggesting that, you know, we have a lot of 3D printed tools for applying pigments to things. Stamps are definitely not a new invention. So if there are a way to create a digital mask of losses in a paper poster, then being able to in-paint those with a digitally constructed mask that's stamped in a way that replicates the process that the original pigments were applied, that's a way that they see it to be applied. But obviously a glossy mask is absolutely inappropriate for paperworks. So it should not, I don't think that's an area that it should be used for.
Yeah. With your suggestion and what paper conservators seem to have told you about this, using the same technique as was used originally for the poster printing, I don't really know if reversibility is thought about in this process, because it's really hard then to know where you in-painted and where there is still the original layer. Let's get back to the other questions, if you don't mind. So one other question is regarding the starting image for processing. Is an orthophoto used as input?
So by orthophoto, I assume basically a photograph with more information besides just the pixel color values. And in this case, I just based it on a basically when I say 3D as in a trichromic presentation of colors on the artwork and a very high resolution image. I did not use additional details such as the structural surface or the topology of the artwork or the light properties of it. And these are, and the code that I have works on those kinds of images that are basically 3 channels per pixel. And that's, I think, a good starting point for developing code for this kind of mask generation. I see a follow-up question that's actually tied to this of how are the losses mapped on an artwork picture, and they're of different depths. So the painting in the study is very topologically flat. And that was, you know, Flemish paintings from the Renaissance were made with a lot of layers of pigment applied and in very thin layers of oil paint. And over time with abrasion, the surface becomes even smoother. So in this case, the surface of the painting was basically purely flat. And what that meant was any loss present on it just had, as you write here, a different depth to it. And some of the deepest losses are basically full panel fissures. So the painting was made on several panels that were eventually warped away from each other. And so there's complete voids there. But a mask film has enough structural integrity to be able to span those voids. And I think that's one of the benefits here, is that I used 0 gesso in the restoration here. So no amount of foreign material was placed into any loss. Like all of the losses were stabilized. And if any paint was starting to detach from the underlying wood panel, I re-adhered that. But otherwise, there's no gesso that has to go into any cracks or between 2 panel fissures. The mask is able to span those directly. And one of the other important applications of that is along the edges of this artwork. So this painting, I don't know necessarily how this happened, but one corner was abraded off. And usually that presents a really difficult challenge of, do you reintegrate a different substrate into there? Do you glue that in? Do you somehow bracket in a structural reintegration there? And in this case, the only thing that I had to do was let the mask film extend past the artwork. And it's, it's very precariously hanging there and just in the air, but it has, enough structural stability like a piece of paper. As long as there's no stresses applied to it, it is able to cover in that centimeter scale loss without anything underneath it. I think that's one of those areas that journalists have not cared at all about, but I think is one of the more intriguing ones, because we've always approached paintings restoration as requiring a degree of structural reintegration for large losses. And this presents an opportunity to avoid that kind of invasive treatment and rely on a micro-thin film to extend past the bounds of losses to reintegrate them more cohesively into an artwork.
Good. There are a few more questions. I don't know if we can all answer today, but if you have a few minutes more, we can maybe read one or two, or is it too tight for you?
Yeah, let me peruse through these. I'll do ones from people that I haven't heard of from.
Okay. Perfect.
So
I don't think there is one.
Oh no, yeah, they're all okay. We've all Thank you all for being so participatory. This is delightful. I'll try to answer these briefly. Okay, so the system, the affordability. So the way that I'm anticipating this will go, I will be I'm actively trying to raise funds to develop this method a bit further and make it accessible. So right now, all of these different components need to be sort of outsourced, and that it involves a fair amount of bringing in together different resources. I'm going to be trying to centralize this so that I can make masks for different projects. So it's not really an affordable system in whole, having all of the components in place, all the instrumentation required to make a mask. It's around $150,000. But I think this is one of those areas where either I or someone else, but presumably me, will be able to centralize a place for making masks, and then you won't have to worry about buying all of those tools to make them. Because the masks, they are just films. It's pretty easy to ship them. So I appreciate that concern, and I'm trying to work on it, and hopefully I'll be able to get the resources to make that facility. From Venetia, I see putting in JPEG images of each different AI model. Yeah. And then from William, is there a way in which image databases are screened? So that's a great question. So you bring up a really important concern that I've tried to explain to journalists, and they just don't really care that much. We don't have a good image database for digital restoration. So, and especially with paintings, the largest database that I've been able to find of works before and after they were restored by a professional conservator, 100 pairs of images. And that's a really small amount to be able to train any model and to be able to account for a lot of these really important aspects of lighting and color corrections. So I think that we just don't have a database for this yet. So that's one of the reasons why all of these partial convolution techniques that I applied for mask generation, they're all very localized, and they only take in image information from the aggregate image that is being worked on. So the important thing there, so in order to make this mask actually work, it needs to be at extremely fine resolution. So the image of the painting in this study is around 11,000 by 14,000 pixels, which is a very large image to work with. But it does mean that there's enough of that pattern information that a partial convolution model can take in and cross-apply for in-painting losses. So for larger databases that could actually be used to make reasonable models, We don't have those yet, and frankly, I don't know who will be able to make one. That's probably an institutional challenge, and some museum might be able to do that if they're like really good at tracking before and after paintings and how they were conserved. So I know that the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. and the Metropolitan Museum, they have a pretty good policy of imaging paintings both before and after restoration in high resolution. I don't know that everyone else does that and will be able to do it. And I think one of the actually interesting points that brings up is there's a lot of people in the computer science space that are interested in making models that do paintings restoration in a way that a conservator would. And if you look at those, there's a lot of papers on this because making digital results is a lot easier than making physical ones. If you read the papers, you'll look at the results and you're going to start crying. They're really bad. So a lot of the in-painting models that people have been making don't consider any of the factors that we worry about in terms of, you know, when is in-painting appropriate? Are you matching the style reasonably well? Are you being precise with how you're applying some kind of model? And they also don't consider some of the nuances of how artworks age and what we want to show for them. So one of the things I bring up with people with some frequency is copper pigments from a few hundred years ago, especially copper greens. Those over time have chemically changed to be either vivid blue or brown. And those are interesting aspects of the artworks. You know, you can see from a lot of Dutch Golden Age floral still lifes, you'll look at them and you'll be like, oh, all of the leaves are blue. And the interesting thing is that's a part of the artwork. That's a very interesting thing. It might not be correct. It might technically count as different from what the artist intended, but that's not something that we would in-paint. And it's those kinds of confusing, challenging ethical questions that I don't think any contemporary in-painting model is able to address because it takes logical reasoning to do so. So that's just to say, the question you bring up, William, is a huge one. I think it's going to take years for us to make meaningful progress on it, regardless of what journalists are saying. Thank you, everyone, for joining into this and for asking such real, relevant, pertinent questions. I think y'all, this has been as interesting as talking with the conservators of the De Young and Legion museums.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alex, for taking the time, also answering all these questions, and yeah, just meeting us at 8 a.m. to start your week like that. So it was really, really interesting, and I hope everyone had a good time.
Yeah.
If anything, I'll send the...
Feel free to reach out to me by email. I'm happy to answer people's questions in more detail. I'm really happy to talk with folks. So
Great.
Thank you for coming.
Maybe I'll send your email with the replay of the whole thing, which I'll try to send to everyone once it's available. Good.
Awesome. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex, and have a lovely day and a lovely week.
You too. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank everyone for coming today, and have a lovely week.